The history of our story began long ago. At one point in time, around 3 billion years ago, we were floating around as little tiny atoms in the little petri dish of the world. Fast forward to around 6 million years ago, and we see the emergence of the first hominids, the family of primates that include humans. 1.9 million years ago, Homo erectus was the first species to leave Africa and colonize other parts of the world. They had larger brains than their primate ancestors. Around 400,000 years ago, the first evidence of the Neanderthals, their bodies were adapted to the cold environments of Europe and Western Asia. Their distinctive facial features were some of the most human-like ever seen. Then came us, the only surviving species of the Homo genus. But how did Homo sapiens rise into a global dominance through the mechanism of civilization? We begin our story in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia in 4000 BCE, nestled between the great Tigris and Euphrates rivers and the Sumerian city of Uruk. Instead of relying on hunting and gathering like our ancestors of the past, the citizens of Uruk were able to develop a way to harvest cereal grains like wheat and barley. However, turning cereal grains into edible foods took a lot of work. In the beginning, they had to use an invention called a hand mill, which consisted of 2 stones. As the grains were crushed between the 2 stones, the flour was collected in a container and stored for future use. This was the start of something great. This complex, strenuous process was our modern world's first example of agriculture. We no longer depended on hunting animals or picking berries for our food. Rather than using human ingenuity, we can create our own food source. This allowed Uruk to prosper into a place with over 50,000 residents. However, this change did have a change on the human body. The average height of men drastically shrunk from 5'9" to 5'3", and for women they shrunk on average from 5'3" to 5 feet. Instead of being the super athletes we were of the past, we were smaller, less noticeable farmers. People also became landlocked, changing the very essence of what it means to be human. In the early 3000 BCE, according to legend, King Gilgamesh began his rule as a Sumerian king of his region. However, by the end of 3000 BCE, the Akkadians ousted the Sumerians. Sargon the Great took power and conquered all of Sumeria, while in the Indus Valley in modern-day Pakistan, a new civilization was growing. The Indus Valley civilization, 3,300 to 1300 BCE, was most notable for its highly advanced toilet system. The toilets were built with a seat and a chute that led to the underground drainage system. The sewage was then carried away from the homes through a network of covered drains, preventing disease spread. The waste was treated and disposed outside of city limits, helping to keep the cities clean and hygienic. While in Egypt, they were more consumed with building pyramids than basic human plumbing. This was because in ancient Egyptian religion, it was believed that when a pharaoh was to die in the physical world, his spirit would continue to live on in the afterlife, in which they would continue to rule in perpetuity and where they would be worshipped by the living. Inside these pyramids, the pharaoh's body was carefully mummified, a process believed to preserve his physical form and help ensure his spirit's journey to the afterlife. The pyramid was also filled with offerings and treasures intended to provide the pharaoh with the resources he would need in the afterlife. Every pharaoh wanted to make sure they were immortal. They wanted to succeed in the afterlife. They wanted to be worshipped forever. That's why it was an utmost priority for Egyptian pharaohs to build pyramids for themselves when laid to rest. It started when Pharaoh Djoser, 2667 to 2648 BCE, built the step pyramid at Saqqara, followed by Sneferu, 2613 to 2589 BCE, who built several pyramids such as the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. Then came the Pharaoh Khufu, 2589 to 2566 BCE, who built the famous Great Pyramid of Giza in a labor-intensive 20-year process, one that the world still marvels at today. Khufu was then followed by pharaohs Khafre and Menkaure, who built these slightly smaller second and third pyramids of Giza respectively. While over in China in the year 2100 BCE, the first Chinese dynasty was upon us. Like the people of Mesopotamia, the Chinese were ever reliant on agriculture, producing rice, wheat and barley, among other crops. However, as legend has it, the Yellow River flooded. These massive floods would destroy all the crops, leading to massive famine and suffering. However, not all was to be lost, because Yu the Great was on his way. I stood distraught by this problem that he would spend his days traveling up and down the Yellow River. He found ways to divert the rivers by building levees and dikes so that he could regulate the waterways. Then, after 13 years of hard work, the floods could no longer wreak havoc on the land. The people were overjoyed, and Yu was hailed as a savior. That was the start of the first Chinese dynasty, the Xia dynasty. Though the accuracy of this tale is questioned by historians, it does establish an important precedent. The idea is that power ought to follow one's merit. An individual who deserves absolute power shall have absolute power. This idea would shape the world for years to come and cause the people of ancient China to follow him to create the first ever Chinese dynasty. While back over in Mesopotamia around 1772 BCE, a Babylonian king named King Hammurabi created the basis of the legal system as we know it today. Hammurabi ordered the creation of a 7-foot-tall, 2-foot-wide stone slab. Written on it was a system of 282 laws that each citizen of his kingdom was to follow. Such laws included various laws such as Law 1. If a man brings an accusation against another man, charging him with murder, but cannot prove it, the accuser shall be put to death. Law 196. If a man destroys the eye of another man, they shall destroy his eye. Law 197 says, if he breaks another man's bone, they shall break it. Law 199. If he destroys the eye of a man's slave or breaks the bone of a man's slave, he shall pay 1/2 his price. However, what King Hammurabi did was create a society based on laws. He laid out strict laws, placing people into certain castes of life and value. Everyone was worth a different amount based on what class they were in society. There was no illusion of equality in ancient Babylon. Instead, it was pretty clear the value of a noble's bone was worth more than a plebeian's, which in turn was worth more than a slave's. An idea we continue to see throughout history. While in modern-day Turkey, a lesser-known civilization came to power. The Hittite Empire under the charismatic rule of the leader, Labanas, 1680 to 1650 BCE. He was a skilled ruler with a single vision in mind, uniting the Hittite city-states under a single rule. Labanas led his army from city to city, conquering neighboring city-states and making alliances with their leaders. He was a shrewd diplomat, and he used his diplomatic skills to win over the hearts and minds of the people. Eventually, Labanas became the ruler of all the Hittite city-states and established the empire. He was a just and fair ruler and was loved by his people. Under his rule, the Hittites prospered and their territory expanded, leaving them right next to their neighbors in Egypt. While in modern-day Greece, a collection of city-states emerged on the European continent. Mycenaean Greece, 1600 BCE to 1100 BCE, was dominated by an elite warrior society and consisted of a network of palace-centered states that developed rigid, hierarchical political, social, and economic systems. At the head of this society was the king. However, unlike a unified civilization, each city was on its own. A city-state is a city that with its surrounding territory forms an independent state. The development of city-states such as Troy, Mycenae, and Pylos start to grow. The first remnants of the Greek written language, known as Linear B, also started to emerge. The first record of any Indo-European Greek record we have today. While back in Egypt, they started to create a social pyramid of another type, the Egyptian social pyramid. Like the Great Pyramid of Giza, it is more prominent at the bottom and tinier at the top. At the bottom lays the peasants and the slaves. They were responsible for doing all the manual labor. They worked on the lands. They would spend the day in and day out farming, producing food for all of Egypt. Then when the season to farm was over for the year, they would work on the pharaoh's massive building projects, literally building the pyramids. Slightly above the slaves came the artisans. They were the stonemasons, the plasters, and the sculptors who created the exuberant art the wealthy desired, and for Egypt is most known for today. Then came the merchants who spent their days in navigating the Nile, trading gold, papyrus, and linen to anyone who could afford it. They were well respected and able to make a healthy profit by selling. Then came the scribes. These masters of the word would go to specialized scribe schools just to master the language of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. In practical use, these scribes took account of the stores of food, various tax documents, and even the daily lives of the pharaoh. After the scribes came the soldiers. The soldiers were tasked with protecting the Egyptian empire. They dedicated their lives to defend or make preemptive strikes against their enemy. Generally, they were well fed. Then near the top came the bureaucrats. These high-ranking government officials did essential tasks at the top of society, like the viziers who ran the logistical tasks necessary to run a civilization. The priests oversaw taking care of the temples to ensure the gods were well cared for. The nobles oversaw specific regions of the empire and kept order in said regions. At the top, the purpose of everyone below was the pharaoh, the king, and the mediator between the gods and the world of men. The pharaohs will be known to be supreme, and all must succumb to it. When the pharaoh dies, he will be buried in a pyramid in which he will help eternally rule over the Egyptian empire. Egyptian society was created to serve the pharaoh. Taxes were taken from the farmers for the pharaoh, and artisans made unique crafts for it. The merchants ensured the pharaoh was well supplied with the needed goods. The scribes would follow the pharaoh and record his thoughts. The soldiers made sure his empire was protected. The bureaucrats did the jobs the pharaoh couldn't do. While the pharaoh sat at the top and communicated with the gods, Pharaoh Ramesses II, 1279 to 1213 BCE, accomplished many extraordinary things by living in this social system. He orchestrated the construction of the Temple of Abu Simbel, the Ramesseum, and the Temple of Karnak. He was also able to grow the Egyptian empire and reconquer lands lost by other pharaohs, except for the land claimed by the Hittite Empire. The Hittite king of the time, Mutwalli II, 1295 to 1272 BCE, was notorious for ordering his troops to attack his Egyptian neighbors. Following the example of Libanus, Mutwalli wanted to unify the world under Hittite rule. However, Ramesses had enough. Other pharaohs in the past have tried to stop the Hittites, but he knew if his empire was to ever succeed, he needed to attack back. His target is the city of Kadesh. Ramesses rode in on his chariot with 4 divisions of 20,000 men ready to dominate and kill Mutwalli. However, the Hittites already knew of the incoming Egyptian invasion through espionage. They fortified their city with 40,000 of his own men. A war was about to commence. Ramesses decided to split up his divisions to force Mutwalli out, but yet Mutwalli never did, a gruesome mistake. Splitting up his forces left him exposed, unable to get an advantage, allowing Mutwalli and the people of Kadesh a chance for victory. Historians believe that all they did was come out from the fortification of Kadesh and trap Ramesses' 2 forces in his army by the river. But yet, for some unknown reason, they never did, leaving the Battle of Kadesh to end in a draw. After the battle, though, both sides decided it would be best to stop attacking each other, that they should live in peace and unity in this world. Then, after the death of Mutwalli, the new king, Hattusili III, took the throne of the Hittite Empire. Through the means of messengers, in the year 1258 BCE, both Ramesses and Hattusili signed the first peace treaty to ever exist. Reading in part, Ramesses the great king, the king of the country of Egypt, shall never attack the country of Hatti to take possession of a part of this country. And Hattusili, the great king of the country of Hatti, shall never attack the country of Egypt to take possession of a part of that country. Then a period of friendship occurred between these two once warring nations. The Hittites were skilled in metalwork and taught the Egyptians to make superior weapons and tools. At the same time, the Egyptians, master of agriculture, shared their knowledge with the Hittites. Trade for the benefit of both civilizations. Both civilizations prospered because of this. Peace can lead to prosperity. The agreement was kept in place until around 1200 BCE, because that's when the Hittite Empire fell because of the constant attacks they faced from the Sea People, leaving the Hittite Empire to be lost in the state of history. While on a continent far away, the first civilization in the Americas was taking foot in modern-day Mexico. The Olmec civilization, 1200 BCE to 400 BCE is often considered the mother civilization of Native American civilizations. However, sadly, though, not much is known about them, mainly due to their writing in a hieroglyph historians still can't decipher. One of the few remains we have are these 17 colossal stone heads. In Mesoamerican culture, there is this belief that the head alone could contain an individual's emotion, experience, and soul. We may not know their leaders' names, like of other civilizations like Ramesses and Hammurabi. When looking through the eyes of a stone head, we can still feel their presence, and in some ways, they remain immortal, enshrined in history. For one day we may learn who they are. While in the East, the Zhou dynasty, 1046 to 256 BCE in China, was taking its stride. The Zhou dynasty gained power because of the failures of the less critical Shang dynasty. They believed in the idea of a mandate from heaven. This resulted in 4 principles in the Chinese dynastical structure that would be repeated repeatedly. 1. Heaven grants the emperor the right to rule. 2. Since there is only one heaven, there can only be one emperor at any given time. 3. The emperor's virtue determines his right to rule. And 4. No one dynasty has a permanent right to. A ruler in dynasty could lose the mandate from heaven, and the heavens weren't always on the side of the rulers. Over time, it will fade into another dynasty. The heavens would send signs of droughts, famines, floods, and earthquakes across the land, signaling they'd lost the blessing of above. This is how the Shang dynasty fell, and the Zhou dynasty grew to prominence. The Zhou dynasty brought another style of government and the creation of feudalism. The system was straightforward, leading to another social pyramid. At the bottom lay the peasants who were tied to the land and whose job was to produce crops for the empire. Then came the soldiers whose job was to protect the lands from foreign invaders. Then the lords who owned the land and taxed the peasants a portion of their crops, who in turn, the lord gave some of their crops to the king. The person in charge of the whole empire, the king would then receive more crops and become very wealthy. All profits go to the king and all work goes to the masses. Why would anyone just settle for a life of farming day in and day out? There are 2 reasons for this phenomenon. The first reason was due to necessity. It took many more people to feed an empire and a family back then, and the second reason being philosophy. Towards the end of the Zhou dynasty, the beginning of Eastern philosophy was created. Confucius created a philosophy system justly named Confucianism, which is focused on the importance of respect, loyalty, and responsibility in all relationships in life. A central concept of Confucianism is called Lai, which can be translated as rituals, customs, or manners. Li refers to the formal and informal social conventions that guide societal behavior. It is seen as maintaining order and harmony in social relationships, while Lao Tzi created another philosophy called Taoism. The word Tao means the way or the path, and Taoism teaches that individuals should seek to align themselves with the natural flow of the universe, rather than fighting against it. Live your life as peacefully with yourself as possible, and don't worry about external things outside your control. Just focus on your farming. One of the most famous contemporaries from Taoism is the idea of yin and yang, representing complementary and interdependent forces in nature, such as light and dark, hot and cold, or masculine and feminine. Taoism teaches that by balancing these opposing forces, individuals can achieve harmony and fulfillment. Confucianism and Taoism made life bearable for ancient Chinese farmers. But as time progressed, the city-states that occupied ancient Greece grew. Around 800 BCE, the Greek city started to realize that the land they occupied was practically infertile. So to produce an essential staple of grain, they had to import it. Hence why the Greek states had to colonize the world around them. The city-state Miletus at its height had over 90 colonies throughout Europe, producing food for the Greeks. At its height, the Greek had set up colonies from modern-day Marseille in France to Rostov-on-Don in Russia. One of these new emerging city-states was Rome. As legend has it, Romulus and Remus were twin brothers, abandoned by their parents and placed into the river Tibet. As the basket floated across the river, a female wolf discovered the 2 orphans and nursed them back to health. When Romulus and Remus became adults, they decided to find the city where the wolf rescued them. However, this created turmoil as both brothers wanted the site to be named after themselves. As Romulus and Remus fought relentlessly, eventually, Romulus came up with the final blow and killed Remus, creating Rome in 753 BC. While the Greek city-states might have been colonizing, Cyrus the Great was about to take over an empire. At the time, the Persians were subjugated to the rule of the Medes Empire. According to legend, after his grandson Cyrus was born, King Astyages of Medes had a vivid dream that his little grandson would one day stage a revolt against. King Astyages knew what to do and ordered his chief advisor to kill the baby. But the chief advisor gave the baby off to a shepherd to be raised instead. However, troubles weren't over for Cyrus. When he was 10, King Astyages found Cyrus. King Astyages wanted to kill him because the dream was very clear. This man will revolt against you. Yet against his better senses, Cyrus was allowed to live. King Astyages' biggest mistake. When Cyrus was a man, he gathered his army and revolted against his maternal grandfather, the two. But as prophecy had it, Astyages surrendered in 550 BCE. However, Cyrus wasn't done conquering. He conquered Babylon and became the supreme ruler of Mesopotamia and even the Indus Valley civilization. The world was in Cyrus's hand. Cyrus then took over the Greek colony of Ionia in Asia Minor, leading a great Persian empire. And then he died, leaving it all in the air for the next great Persian king, Darius the Great. While back in Greece, various city-states started to gain power, but two were at the forefront, Sparta and Athens. Sparta was a military powerhouse. The famous Spartans believed everything should focus on physical strength and war. When a new young Spartan was born, it would be slaughtered if it didn't look healthy. Boys were taken from their families at a young age and were trained to become soldiers. The brutal training included physical conditioning, weapons training, and harsh living conditions. The entire life of a Spartan was to win a war. Their society reflected with three main groups. The ruling class consisted of aristocrats who held political power, the free non-citizens who were not allowed to participate in government, but were still expected to serve in the military. And the helots, a group of enslaved people that provided labor for the Spartan state. Life in Sparta was harsh, brutal, and militaristic. While their neighbors up north were experimenting with this idea of democracy, Athenian democracy was a highly complicated mess. There were two branches, the Council of 500 and the Assembly. The Council of 500 was selected randomly by a process known as sortition. Athens itself was made up of 10 different tribes. Each tribe was responsible for providing 50 citizens to serve for 1 year in the Council of 500 via random selection. Each eligible citizen would be given a personalized token. Those tokens were inserted into a particular machine called the Clariterion. This long-lost technology included tubes and balls, which somehow selected 50 residents of each tribe to join the illustrious Council of 500. While in the Assembly, there was a system in place that said that every single citizen had a vote. Of course, to be a citizen, you had to be a male and not a slave, and either born in Athens or to Athenian parents. The Council of 500 would create the agenda for the main assembly to vote on because over 30,000 people could have a vote at any given time. It was total chaos. So to quell this, the council would nominate 9 presidents the morning of the meeting, and it was their job to ensure all the rules and procedures were being followed. Since they were appointed right before the assembly met, they were almost impossible to bribe. Somehow the assembly would loudly vote on whether a bill would pass. They would vote on matters like appointing generals, various laws, and other government bureaucracy. However, not everyone liked this Athenian democracy. The famous Greek philosopher Plato thought the idea was barbaric. In Book 6 of his seminal book, The Republic, Plato writes, "The true navigator must study the seasons of the year, the sky, the stars, the winds, and all the other subjects appropriate to his profession if he is really fit to control the ship." Think that it's quite impossible to acquire the professional skill needed for such control, and that there's no such thing as the art of navigation. How much could a randomly selected member of the Council of 500 really know? How much could he fully contribute to society? should we allow a random member of society to have any power? Instead, Plato would advocate for the idea of a philosopher king, a man who studies wisdom, logic, and reasoning. A man who dedicates his life to understanding how to be just, a man who will become the navigator of wisdom. Plato would rather say, the society we have described can never grow into a reality or see the light of day, and there will be no end to the troubles of the states, or indeed, my dear Glaucon, of humanity itself. Till philosophers become rulers in this world, or till those we now call kings and rulers really and truly become philosophers and political power and philosophy, thus come into the same hands. There's just one issue with Plato's quote. Every leader thinks they're a philosopher king. Everyone thinks their thoughts are the best. Everyone thinks their ideas are the wisest. From Yu the Great in China to Labanas of the Hittite Empire, to Siddhartha Gautama of the Kingdom of Magadha in India. While not so far away in the Indian kingdom of Magadha, a spoiled prince named Siddhartha Gautama, 500 BCE, lived in luxury inside a palace. Inside this palace, Siddhartha could have anything he wanted, all the jewels, all the wealth, all the finest goods thrust upon him. His world inside of the palace was a utopia on earth. There was no want, need, or desire, and it was perfect. Until he went outside his palace compound, the only place he ever knew. As he took his first steps outside of his palace, what he saw struck a chord. He saw an old man dying right on the street. In front, he realized that the human experience wasn't something that was perfect and sublime. Instead, it was death. As Gilgamesh realized many years ago, this was an inevitable part of the human experience. Siddhartha left his life of luxury behind and began a quest for knowledge and enlightenment. He studied with spiritual teachers and meditated for many years, searching for answers to life's big questions. Finally, after 6 years of seeking, he sat down under a fig tree and meditated until he achieved enlightenment. Enlightenment is a state of inner peace in which one has transcended the limitations of the ego and is in touch with a universal consciousness or divine essence. It isn't a fixed and permanent thing, but rather an ongoing process of growth and development. But under that fig tree, Siddhartha became known as the Buddha, or the Awakened One. He would spend the rest of his life traveling the countryside, becoming close to the Enlightenment. Darius was determined to follow in his father's footsteps and take over the world. After finalizing their rule over the city-state of Ionia, the Persians were on a quest to take over Greece. Darius and his 20,000 men came to the city of Marathon in the year 490 BCE, a city 26.2 miles away from Athens. The Athenians were vastly outnumbered, with only 10,000 men. As the Persians were trying to regroup, the powerful Greek hoplites crushed the weaker Persian foot soldiers by routing the wings before turning towards the center of the Persian line. The remnants of the Persian army fled to their ships and left the battle. Early historians believe the battlefield littered 6,400 Persian bodies, while the Athenians lost only 192. So the Persians retreated, and an Athenian messenger named Phedippides ran the 26.2 miles from Marathon to Athens, exclaiming with joy how the Athenians just beat the mighty Persian Empire. All of Athens went crazy with this fantastic news, hence leading to Phedippides' historic trek to be sketched into history as the world's first marathon. However, the Persians weren't done. Even with Darius, dying of mysterious circumstances, his son Xerxes I took over the crown and wanted to complete his grandfather's legacy. In 480 BCE, Xerxes I wanted revenge, so he brought his enormous invasion force of over 100,000 soldiers and was dead set on conquering Greece. Then, at a narrow pass at Thermopylae, the Spartan king Leonidas had his force of 7,000 Spartans maintain the defense. Leonidas knew of his disadvantage and developed a bold and daring plan to defeat the Persians. Rather than waiting for the Persians to attack, Leonidas ordered his soldiers to make a surprise attack on the Persian camp, catching the Persians off guard and disrupting their formation. Despite their success, the Greek army was ultimately overwhelmed by the Persians, who attacked from all sides and eventually broke through the Greek defenses. Leonidas and his soldiers fought with courage and determination. Still, they were ultimately defeated. Then came the Battle of Salamis, where the Greeks could change the tilt of the war in a naval battle between the 500 Persian trireme and 300 Greek trireme. It didn't look good for the Greeks. Still, the great Athenian general Themistocles employed his plan to move the Persian fleet into the narrow straits of Salamis and hit the enemy fleet so hard that it had nowhere to retreat. After a massive sea battle, Themistocles won Greece the victory and changed the face of the war. The Persians still had their goal: conquer the Greek city-states. Xerxes had returned to Persia, leaving Persian General Mardonius in charge of the Persian force. For most of the significant battle yet, after diplomatic talks ceased, Persia knew they had to attack. As the Persians sent their troops to Plataea, the Greeks knew they had to work together. With 30 various Greek city-states working together, they were able to fill the massive 110,000 hoplite army with the primary purpose of defeating Persia. Though that was nothing compared to the estimated 150,000-man army of Persia, the battle was fierce and intense. With both sides fighting with ferocity and determination, the Greek hoplites continued to be effective against the Persian indistinct and archers. The Greeks also strategically used the terrain, fighting on a slope that helped offset the Persian numerical advantage. In the end, the Greeks defeated the Persian forces and secured a decisive victory. The Persians suffered heavy losses and Mardonius was killed in the fighting. The Battle of Plataea marked the end of the Greco-Persian Wars and the Persian threat to Greece. After the Persian War, life in ancient Greece was spectacular. A golden age of culture was upon us. With no longer having to face the threat of war, Athens was able to create architectural wonders such as the Parthenon. The Parthenon sits upon the Athenian Acropolis, a prominent hill overlooking the city of Athens to show its wealth and culture. No matter where you'll go in Athens, you can still see the great Parthenon, even today. Then came the theater. Around this time, the state would sponsor the most significant poets to create stories in the Athenian festival, called the City Dionysia. A festival designed to worship the Greek god of theater and fertility, Dionysus, creating playwrights such as Sophocles, Aeschylus, and Aristophanes. States were hungry for power. Athens was recruiting city-states into their Delian alliance, while Sparta was recruiting city-states into their Peloponnesian alliance. Both Sparta and Athens felt like they should control the city of Corcyra. Hence why in 434 BCE war was upon the Greek peninsula, resulting in naval battles such as the Battle of Sybota and the Battle of Pylos. By 421 BCE, a short peace was negotiated. However, this peace would not last, and Athens had their eyes on Sicily. Initially, the expedition was going well. The Athenians established alliances with several Sicilian cities and won several minor skirmishes against the Sicilian forces. But soon Alcibiades, one of the greatest naval generals in history, was recalled to Athens to face charges of sacrilege. The Athenian fleet was left without his leadership. In his absence, the expedition began to unravel. The Athenians could not take the city of Syracuse, which had fortified its defenses and was well prepared for a siege. The Sicilians were aided by reinforcements from Sparta, which saw an opportunity to strike a crippling blow against its arch-rival Athens. The Athenians suffered from a lack of supplies and were plagued by disease. At the same time, the Syracusans launched a series of surprise attacks and ambushes. Finally, after months of grueling fighting, the Athenian fleet was destroyed in a decisive battle. Thousands of Athenians were killed, and many more were captured and enslaved. A decade after that, Athens fell to the Spartans. The age of legendary Greece was now over. Both Athens and Sparta were significantly weaker, never to regain the same power they once had, leaving the world ready for a philosopher king to conquer it all. Then in the east, the mandate of heaven was the Zhou dynasty after a long 800-year rule. It was deemed by the heavens that their empire was up, which led to a period known as the Warring States, 474 to 221 BCE. This resulted in Han Phizi, who created a new philosophy called legalism. Followers of legalism believed that people were inherently selfish and would only act in their own self-interest, and that the only way to keep them in line was through a system of rewards and punishments that was clear and consistently enforced. This resulted in Fizi claiming that the best way to achieve social order was by establishing a powerful ruler responsible for enforcing the law and punishing wrongdoers. He also believed the ruler should have complete control over the military, the economy, and society. While in the heart of the Oaxaca region of Mexico, the Zapotec civilization started to flourish. The capital city of Monte Alban was being built on a mountain top overlooking the entire Oaxaca Valley. Perched on the mountaintop overlooking the valley of Oaxaca, the city was home to a ruling elite who oversaw a hierarchical social structure that included middle-class artisans and lower-class farmers. The people of the Zapotec civilization were known for their innovative agricultural practices, including the cultivation of maize and other crops, which sustained their communities in times of drought and other environmental pressures. They also developed an early writing system which used a combination of symbols and glyphs to represent words and ideas. They developed an advanced calendar system based on 260-day and 365-day solar cycle. In Greece during the year 356 BCE in the city of Pella in the kingdom of Macedon, the greatest commander in history was born. Alexander the Great grew up knowing he would be a leader and was the son of King Philippine and Queen Olympia. But the teacher was much more impressive. Since he was a kid, Alexander was tutored by Aristotle. Aristotle is the man who is known as the father of logic. He created the fields of biology and taxonomy by introducing a way to think called the scientific method, a method that is still taught in schools to this day. He also wrote extensively about philosophy, ethics, and art, changing the face of the world as we know it today. This is the man who is in charge of teaching Alexander the Great. Alexander was 20 when his father was assassinated, but his excellent education allowed him to take over the rest of the world. After his father died in 336 BCE, Alexander was hell-bent on keeping his family's power. So when the Greek city of Thebes decided to revolt, Alexander and his army marched 240 miles in 14 days. When Thebes refused to surrender, he razed the entire city to the ground, and 6,000 were killed, and the rest were sold into slavery. The rest of the Greek city-states recoiled in fear, allowing Alexander to do as he pleased, leaving for his new target to be Persia and the new Persian king, Darius III. In 333 BC, Alexander faced the Persian army at the Battle of Issus. This significant engagement saw the Persian king, Darius III, defeated and forced to flee. Alexander then captured several key cities, including the vital port of Tyre, which had resisted his initial siege. In 331 BC, Alexander faced Darius III again at the Battle of Gaugamela, near the Tigris River in modern-day Iraq. Despite being outnumbered, Alexander won a decisive victory using superior tactics and mobility. The Persian army was shattered, and Darius III fled once again. Alexander then proceeded to capture the Persian capital of Babylon and took control of much of Mesopotamia. He continued his campaign eastward, winning battles in what is now modern-day Iran and Afghanistan. In 330 BC, he captured the Persian capital of Persepolis, a city of great wealth and cultural significance. But Alexander wasn't done. He wanted to expand eastward, eventually crossing the Hindu Kush mountains into India. However, his troops grew tired of the endless fighting and refused to go any further, and Alexander was forced to turn back. However, after Alexander failed in the Indian subcontinent, a powerhouse emerged in India called the Mauryan Empire. At its height, it spanned over much of India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan. However, this conquering came at much of a cost for its leader, Ashoka the Great. In 261 BC, after the death of his parents, Ashoka decided that his empire needed to expand. In his sights, the kingdom of Kalinga. The war was bloody, the war was fierce. Over 100,000 people died. Ashoka couldn't sleep with himself. He didn't know how to deal with his actions that resulted in so much death, so he turned to the teaching of the Buddha. Under Ashoka's rule, the Mauryan Empire became known for supporting Buddhist teachings and promoting non-violence. Ashoka issued a series of edicts inscribed on rocks and pillars throughout the empire that promoted principles such as kindness, respect for all religions, and the abolition of slavery. Certain traits were not shared in the West by Alexander. In the West, it was deemed honorable to die in combat, and a hero's death would be remembered forever. A farmer will die in anonymity. Alexander died a few years later in Babylon at the age of 32. Throughout his expedition, Alexander was spreading Greek ideas founded by his once wise teacher, bringing the rise of Greek ideals across the land, starting the seeds of the Western cultures we see today. Once Alexander died, his empire just could not sustain itself. His generals feuded as to who should be the leader of this great empire. Everyone wanted power, yet infighting left to waste in oblivion. Eventually, in 323 BC, after senseless wars, the Greek generals divided the world into three major empires: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in the east, and the Antigonids in Greece. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's generals, led Egypt into a period of prosperity. Inspiration by his former leader, Ptolemy built the Library of Alexandria, a hub for an intellectual scholarship. Intellectuals from all over will come to the library to exchange ideas and thoughts throughout the world, leaving us to have great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle to be the backbone of our culture. While the general Seleucid was given the keys to the city of Babylon, Babylon at this time was a cultural hub, melting Greek, Persian, Indian, and Central Asian cultures. Seleucid, though, preferred Greek ideas and Greek language. The Seleucid Empire was at its height during the reign of King Antiochus III, 223 BC to 187 BC. Under King Antiochus III, the Seleucids encompassed a vast territory from modern-day Turkey to modern-day Pakistan, one of the largest empires on record until the rise of the Romans. While the Antigonids did not have nearly as much success, by the time Antigonus I took power, the Greeks were just a shell of what they once were. The age of the Greeks was behind us. The Ptolemies, the Seleucids, and the Antigonids went astray from the Roman Empire. However, for Rome to rise, it had to face a powerful foe, Carthage. Both Rome and Carthage had a desire for the same city-state, Messina on the island of Sicily. This would give either civilization a foothold to grab power in the Mediterranean. The First Punic War was upon us, and after 20 years of fighting in the year 241 BCE and the defeat of Carthage, the Treaty of Leftaeus was signed. The peace, though, was short-lived. In 218 BCE, the Second Punic Wars began when the Carthaginian general Hannibal invaded Italy with his army, including elephants, to conquer Rome. Hannibal won several early battles, including the Battle of Cannae in 216 BCE. Still, he was ultimately defeated by the Roman general Scipio Africanus at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. The war resulted in the complete defeat of Carthage, which was forced to cede its territories to Rome, and the end of the Carthaginian Empire. There was no doubt in the world anymore that it was time for the Romans to take charge in the West. While in the East, after the end of the Warring States period, Qin Shi Huang and the Qin dynasty were an absolute power. 221 BCE to 206 BCE, Qin was determined to turn diverse China into a unified Chinese empire. He divided the lands into 36 command areas, supervised by a governor, military commander, and imperial inspector. It was expected that you followed the will of Qin, or else you would face harsh penalties. The basic ideas of legalism in action, strong government, harsh laws, and inheriting knowing that humans were necessarily selfish. However, their mandate from heaven ran quite quickly. After Qin Shi Huang's death, China was in turmoil with another dynasty on foot. Liu Bang, leader from 206 to 195 BCE, after leading a revolt against the Qin, was declared emperor of the new Han dynasty. Instead of following the strict legalistic mindset of the Qin, Liu decided to set his empire as a Confucianist paradise. The ideals of moderation, virtue, and piety as set through Confucianism were marched throughout the empire, weaving the cocoon of a powerful dynasty. During the Han Dynasty, the production of silk was ever increasing, and the idea of profits was in the minds of all. So in 138 BCE, Emperor Han Wu sent an imperial convoy to make contact with cultures of Central Asia and the Mediterranean. Then after the routes were established, Chinese merchants and traders would bring their silk across the Silk Road to the Middle East and eventually Europe, where it would be sold at high profits. Though in the beginning, the route was relatively short because in 97 BC Ambassador Gan Ying was sent to Rome with gifts of silk for their empire. However, Gan only got as far as Mesopotamia because he was told by the Parthians, the dominant empire in Iran at the time, that the journey would take years. Little did Gan know that he was misinformed, that the journey would have been relatively shorter, but the Parthians wanted to keep their spot as the middlemen. They did not want China and Rome to have contact with one another, creating a system of three empires smooshed right up against each other. Rome in the west, Parthians in the center, and China in the east. Then in 86 BCE, Greece, already being weakened by the conquest of Alexander the Great, was now the target of the Roman Empire. General Lucius Cornelius Sulla led an army of legions to the forefront of Athens. He besieged Athens for several months, brutally torturing the citizens within. Eventually, when Athens fell, he ordered his soldiers to loot and pillage the city, destroying many important cultural treasures. This takeover cemented Rome as a superpower. Athens no longer had the power, but rather it was in Rome. While in 63 BCE, General Pompey was tasked with capturing Jerusalem and the region of Galilee. The Romans quickly captured the cities, forcing Galilee to be placed under Roman rule, including a small village called Nazareth. The Romans' desire to expand didn't end in Galilee, though. In 58 BCE, Julius Caesar was appointed governor of the Roman Provide of Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, with the express assignment of conquering the rest of the Gauls. At the time, the Gauls were a group of Celtic peoples who lived in that area that is now France, Belgium, and parts of Switzerland, Germany, and Italy. However, it was Caesar's job to take over these Celtic tribes, while the Gauls, who were insistent on their independence, all had to work together under the leadership of Vercingetorix in a last-ditch attempt to stop the Romans. As Caesar brought his troops to Alesia in 52 BC, war was upon us. Alesia was surrounded by a double wall and a ditch with additional fortifications on the town's heels. Vercingetorix had gathered a large force of Gallic warriors inside the town. In contrast, Caesar had assembled a sizable Roman army outside the walls. Caesar realized that a direct assault on the town would be complex, so he surrounded the Gallic forces and starved them into submission. He ordered the construction of a series of fortifications around Alesia, including a circumvallation wall that encircled the town and a second wall, and ditch that faced outward to defend against any attempts to break out. Over several weeks, Caesar's forces engaged in a grueling siege of Alesia, with both sides suffering heavy losses. The Gallic warriors inside the town made several attempts to break out, but they were repelled by the Roman forces. The tide of the battle turned in favor of the Romans. When a second Gallic army, led by Vercingetorix's ally Commius, attempted to relieve the siege, Caesar sent a detachment of his forces to intercept the Gallic reinforcements. After a fierce battle, the Roman soldiers emerged victorious. With his forces surrounded and facing starvation, Vercingetorix was forced to surrender. He emerged from Alesia and offered himself as a prisoner to Caesar, effectively ending the Gallic resistance to Roman rule. Throughout the next 2 years, Caesar crossed the Gallic Empire, conquering and implementing it into Rome. The Gauls were implemented into Rome, even gaining citizenship within the empire. However, the Senate was not happy with Caesar. Even though he had great success against the Gauls, the Roman Senate wanted him to stop. They did not like the popularity Caesar was gaining, nor the power he was controlling. So the Roman Senate called upon Caesar to resign his command and disband his army, or risk being declared an enemy of the state. This led Caesar to an essential choice to make. Will he either follow the will of the Roman Senate, or ignore them and start a bloody civil war? Roman law at the time prohibited any general from crossing the Rubicon River and entering mainland Italy with a standing army, without the express permission of the Roman Senate. To do so would be treason, and this tiny stream would reveal Caesar's intentions and mark the point of no return. Civil war was imminent as Caesar and his army marched over the Rubicon. Battles in Corfinium and Pharsalus showed the Senate that Caesar was a worthy foe. So the Roman Senate appointed his son-in-law, Gnaeus Pompey, to lead the Roman forces against his father-in-law. Both parties knew the importance of Spain due to it providing a link between Italy and the rest of Europe. The two armies clashed near the town of Islamic in northeastern Spain. Caesar's army was significantly outnumbered, but he could use his superior military tactics and training to gain the upper hand in the battle. After several days of intense fighting, Caesar emerged victorious, forcing Pompey's forces to retreat, declaring Caesar as the new leader of Rome. When Caesar made it back to Rome, the crowds were chanting, "Hail Caesar! Hail Caesar!" The people then decided that he would be the dictator of Rome for life. Caesar immediately set to work, implementing a series of reforms and policies aimed at improving ordinary Romans' lives and strengthening the central government's power. He ordered the construction of new infrastructure such as roads, bridges, and aqueducts, which helped to connect different parts of the city and improve trade and commerce. Caesar also enacted a series of political and social reforms, including granting citizenship to many people living in the Roman Empire and creating new laws and customs that were based on Roman practices. He encouraged the spread of the Latin language and culture throughout the city and established the Julian calendar, which is the basis of the calendar we use today. However, Caesar's reign was short-lived because 2 years later, in 44 BC, he was stabbed to death by two loyal senators, Cassius and Brutus. The assassination of Caesar led the Roman world into disarray. The world was filled with factions, vying for government control without a strong leader. Octavian, Caesar's son, who was 18 then, came to Rome to claim his inheritance and assert his place in the political landscape. He quickly aligned himself with Caesar's loyal lieutenant Mark Antony. Together, they defeated Caesar's assassins at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. However, tension soon arose between Octavian and Antony as both men vied for control of the Roman Empire. In 31 BCE, their forces clashed in the naval battle of Actium, which resulted in Octavian emerging as the clear victor. Antony fled to Egypt with his lover Cleopatra, and the two committed suicide the following year. With Antony's defeat, Octavian emerged as the undisputed ruler of Rome. In 27 BCE, he was appointed Augustus and became the first Roman emperor. During Augustus's reign, a man who would change the world was born in the Roman-occupied city of Bethlehem. Jesus Christ. The Gospel of Luke says, "In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered." This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. Luke 2, 1-3. This census was an essential factor in Roman society because it established the population counts in these various communities, making it possible to tax these various citizens. So the highly pregnant Mary and her betrothed husband Joseph had to travel 90 miles on foot from Nazareth to Bethlehem to complete this legally required Roman census. When they arrived in Bethlehem, many other descendants of the King of David or members of the Jewish faith were also going to Bethlehem for the census. They found out that there was no room for them in the inn, so they were forced to take shelter in a stable where Mary gave birth to Jesus. Jesus was later named King of the Jews. After Jesus' birthday and the completion of the census, Mary and Joseph returned to Nazareth with their extraordinary son. As the years of Jesus went on, stories about him grew. More and more followers began to worship Jesus as their Messiah. They claim that he can catch an endless amount of fish. They claim that he can cure the blind, and they claim that he was the Son of God. So these followers, specifically his disciples, started to write down his entire life journey. 4 of his closest disciples, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, wrote down the main chunks of the book in these parts called Gospels. Each of these Gospels covered almost all of the same events, the narrative life of Jesus Christ. This narrative testimony of a child born in a stable changed the world forever. Even though many loved Jesus, some viewed him as a threat. Emperor Tiberius succeeded Augustus and reigned from 14 AD to 37 AD. Tiberius was notorious for his delators, a network of informants rewarded for spying and reporting on suspected traitors and criminals. Criminals reported on by the delators had to face a treason trial, often resulting in executions or forced suicides. The city was laid out in a grid pattern with main roads and smaller side streets leading to plazas and public buildings. The city was also divided into different districts, each with specialized functions such as residential, administrative, and religious, leaving it to be in use for 8,000 years after that. While back in Rome, after the end of Trajan's reign in 117 AD, a new emperor with a purpose was in hand. Hadrian was a man tasked with the near impossible, keeping the massive Roman Empire. Under one rule, he first had to deal with a crisis with the newly colonized Roman Britain. Like their predecessors in Judea, the Roman Brits did not like being Roman, so they started to cause unrest, and in the eyes of Hadrian, a real threat of revolution was on his mind. So Hadrian had ordered a massive wall aptly named Hadrian's Wall, which spanned almost coast to coast, keeping it sunk in the conquered people's minds that the Romans were here, staving off revolution in one region. However, in Galilee, things weren't as peaceful. Simon Bar Kokhba led a rebellion of the Jewish people to free themselves from Roman rule. As you see, Rome was developing a new city called Aelia Capitolina, over the ruins of Jerusalem, from the last revolt, with temples dedicated to polytheistic gods like Jupiter. By 132, Bar Kokhba took the indistinctive Nasi head of state. Many Jews regarded him as the Messiah, who would save the Jewish people and restore their independence. Kokhba's troops would storm Aelia Capitolina, almost knocking out entirely the Roman garrison controlling the city. Hadrian, though, would not have it. So he sent a force of 120,000 men to the lands of Judea to conquer and force the Jewish people into submission. As Cassius Dio says, in the history of Rome, 50 of their most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed. 580,000 men were slain in the various raids and battles, and the number of those that perished by famine, disease, and fire was past finding out. Thus, nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. History of Rome 69.14, 1-2. Rome made it clear that it was not to be taken lightly. While in China, the message was quite different. The ideas of Buddhism were spreading, along with the Chinese philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism, and built a dynasty. These three philosophies worked together to make the Han dynasty stronger and more united in many ways. While in America, the Mayan architects went across northern Peyton and designed a series of short, broad temples with wide staircases, flanked by enormous stucco masks. These stucco masks were made of plaster and some burned and powdered limestone. The Mayans built these stone armatures into elaborate deity faces to capture the soul of the gods and bring it to the people. A temple like the E7 South. Yes, historians named the Mayan temples like military submarines as a pyramid with 16 stucco masks. Each allows us to go deeper into the souls of these deities of the past. In the Middle East, a new empire was emerging with roots in the past. A man named Ardashir claimed to have a royal blood that traced all the way back to Cyrus the Great. Ardashir claimed that he should be the true ruler of the Persian Empire, not those frauds of the Parthians. Ardashir was able to unite the various tribes of Persia. In 224 AD, Zardath's forces against the Parthian king, Artabatus V. In a significant battle at Hormozgan, Ardashir I quickly established a centralized government and built a new capital at Ctesiphon on the Tigris River. He re-established the Zoroastrian religion, which had been suppressed by the Parthians, as the empire's official religion. He also built a powerful military machine with skilled cavalry and archers. He began to expand his territory by conquering neighboring regions. As the Parthians were on their way out, so were the Han. The Han dynasty's downfall was marked by political instability, economic problems, external threats, internal rebellions, and power struggle. The weakening of central authority allowed regional warlords to seize power, and the government's attempts to address economic issues were unsuccessful. External threats and rebellions weakened the dynasty even further. A warlord named Kalpi declared himself emperor and established the Huai dynasty, officially ending the Han dynasty. While back in Rome, Emperor Diocletian 284 to 305 faced a problem. Rome was becoming too large and impossible to manage. So Diocletian created the Tetrarchy and divided the region into four, where each region was governed by a separate emperor. Within the Tetrarchy, there were two types of emperors, Augustus and Caesars. Dion chose Maximilian to be his equal to Augustus. In contrast, Galerius and Constantius were appointed to be Caesars. However, this system created uncontrolled chaos and anarchy. Each emperor had desires for power and ambition, and it all came to a head in 305 when power shifted. Both Diocletian and Maximian retired, and in 306 Constantius died. 3 out of the 4 original leaders were left out of the system, leading to a power vacuum to come. Emperor Constantine the Great was appointed by his father's army unilaterally as an Augustus and a Caesar at the same time to replace his father. At the same time, Maximian's son Maxentius felt as though he should have been appointed Caesar instead of Valerius Severus. So in 307, Maxentius sent his army and forced Valerius Severus to surrender. Come 308, Galerius appointed Nicutlason. So on the west side of Rome, 2 emperors wanted to rule. Constantine ruled over Gaul in Britain, and Maxentius ruled Italy and North Africa. Maxentius had a difficult time consolidating his power, and he faced increasing resistance from the people of Rome. To try and secure his hold on power, Maxentius ordered the construction of a new bridge across the Tiber River near Rome, known as the Milvian Bridge. Constantine saw Maxentius as a threat to his power, so he decided to march on Rome to confront him. As the 2 armies approached each other near the Milvian Bridge, Constantine had a vision of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this sign conquer." Some accounts suggest that this vision may have been a dream or a hallucination, while others suggest that it may have been a sign from God. Regardless of the nature of the vision, Constantine took it as a sign that he would be victorious in battle if he fought under the sign of the Christian cross. He had his soldiers paint this symbol on their shields and banners, and he went into battle with renewed vigor and confidence. The battle was fierce and brutal, with both sides suffering heavy losses. Maxentius had a larger army, but his troops were spread out and disorganized. Constantine was able to take advantage of this, and he was able to push Maxentius' forces back towards the Tiber River. In the chaos of the retreat, Maxentius was forced off the Milvian Bridge and into the water, where he drowned. Shortly after his victory, Constantine met Licinius at Mediolanum, modern Milan, to confirm several political and dynastic arrangements to produce the Edict of Milan. This edict gave power for Eastern Rome to Licinius and Constantine's sole power of the West. More importantly, though, this document extended religious tolerance for Christians and restored any properties confiscated from them during the persecution. However, the peaceful coexistence of both rulers was short-lived. Though the edict allowed for the safety of Christians, Licinius was still very much a paganist. Their differences started to grow. All came near the city of Chrysopolis in 324 AD, where both armies went and fought. Constantine's military might was on display. He was able to force the Eastern Roman army towards the sea, leaving many to be killed or captured. Constantine was declared the sole leader of Rome, and Licinius was declared dead by hanging. He renamed the Eastern Roman capital from Byzantium to Constantinople to celebrate his victory. Then in 325 AD, Constantine presided over the First Council of Nicaea, when the 300 bishops established the now famous Nicene Creed, which declared that Jesus Christ was begotten, not made, and of one substance with the Father. Constantine was finally baptized as a Christian on his deathbed in 337 AD. Come 370 AD, a new player was on the scenes. The Huns were a barbaric, nomadic civilization who were masters of warfare. According to legends, they were taught horsemanship as early as the age of 3. Also, they would attack their own with a sword to teach them how to endure pain. These people weren't to be messed lightly with. When they crossed the Volga River in 370 on their horses and lusted for blood, the Alan civilization didn't stand much chance. 2 years later, they attacked the Ostrogoths, an eastern tribe of Germanic Goths, who harassed the Roman Empire by frequently attacking their territories. By 376, the Huns had attacked the Visigoths, the western tribe of Goths, and forced them to seek sanctuary within the Roman Empire. As the Huns dominated Goth and Visigoth lands, they earned a new reputation as the new barbarians in town and seemed unstoppable. By 395 AD, they began invading Roman domains, and some Roman Christians believed they were devils who arrived straight from hell. The reason they started invading Rome was because of the death of Theodosius the Great. His shining achievement as emperor was keeping the Goths and the Huns at bay, but on death, he decided to follow the ideas of Diocletian and split the empire up again, splitting up control between his two sons, Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, making Theodosius the last leader of a united Rome. With Honorius in charge, the incapable general made Western Rome an easy target to be bullied. The Visigoths, looking for a new place to live, had their eyes set on Rome. So throughout the early 410s, the Visigoths ransacked various Roman cities. Then on August 24, 410, the Visigoths sacked Rome, taking control of this historic city. It was the first time in nearly 800 years that a foreign army occupied the city of Rome. However, the Visigoths couldn't maintain control of Rome. Instead, they continued to ransack Roman territories until they established their kingdom in 418 in modern-day Spain. While the prospects of existence weren't so much better in eastern Rome, the notorious Attila the Hun was gaining power, and his brutal tactics called him the Scourge of God. After a failed peace attempt in 441, Attila and his army stormed through the Balkans and the Danubian frontier. In 452, with Rome in sight, he met Pope Leo I, who acted as an emissary between Attila and Rome. There's no record of what they discussed. Still, according to legend, the apparitions of St. Paul and St. Peter appeared to Attila. They threatened to kill him if he didn't negotiate with Pope Leo I. In the small town of Mecca, a nomadic tribe called the Quraysh gave birth to a man who would change the religious world. Yet again, Muhammad was orphaned at an early age and was raised by his grandfather, and later his uncle. In China, during the rule of the Tang, religions like Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism all coexisted peacefully. A citizen was able to believe what they wanted to believe, leaving for many temples and pagodas to be built across the empire. At this time, people would willingly farm on lands, giving up their freedom to these local leaders to protect them from the Vikings, creating the basis of a new system of feudalism. While the Holy Roman Empire might have been fighting with the Vikings and the Byzantines were fighting with the Arabs. With the support of Adalberon, the Archbishop of Reims, Hugh Capet became the first king of France, starting the Capetian dynasty. However, at this time, the typical person in Europe was always living in fear. Every civilization was on the verge of conquering. Hence, the Christians took over the county of Edessa in 1098, and finally the holy city of Jerusalem in 1099. However, the crusade wasn't done. In 1144, the Muslim forces led by Turkish ruler Ahmad ad-Din Zengi launched a siege against Edessa. Genghis Khan then deserted him, his mother and his 6 siblings to avoid having to feed them. However, he soon began to make friends with the other clans throughout the Mongolian mountainside. By 1206, he had united all the various tribes, uniting 1 million people. In a letter summoning Parliament, King Edward I, since the most righteous law of the emperors, ordains that what touches all should be approved by all. So it appears that common danger should be met by remedies agreed upon in common. In 1428, at the age of 16, Joan left her home in the village of Domremy and traveled to the court of Charles VII, where she asked for permission to lead the French army against the English. At first, her request was met with skepticism and disbelief. When he and his crew set up camp, he met the Lucayans, skilled fishermen and farmers who welcomed him and his crew and provided them with food and supplies. While back in Europe, a golden age of culture was upon us. In 1503, Leonardo da Vinci painted the Mona Lisa. Then, following the strategy of Cortés, Francisco Pizarro led an expedition that conquered the Incan Empire in present-day Peru. Though the violence was authoritarian, the biohazards were even more demanding. While back in the old world, they were having a new era of fighting. the 30 Years' War. This time, it was between the Protestants and the Catholics. It began in 1618 when the Holy Roman Emperor attempted to impose Catholicism on the Protestant population of Bohemia. Mozart's Hafner Serenade is a charming and elegant work featuring courtly dance music and light, lyrical melodies. Its graceful melodies, subtle harmonies, and elegant instrumental writing characterize it. As the war continued, King George III sent his armies of the masses over to America. Thousands of people were arrested, tried, and executed for crimes against the revolution. Robespierre became known as a ruthless and uncompromising figure. However, Robespierre's power began to wane as the people grew tired of the violence and the instability of the revolution. At first, the European powers were cautious, sending explorers and missionaries into Africa to establish trade networks and alliances with local leaders. However, as competition increased, the European powers became more aggressive in their tactics. At the end of the poem, Gilgamesh realizes, "Life, which you look for, you will never find. For when gods created man, they let death be his share and life withheld in their own hands." The history of human civilizations is an incomplete book, constantly being updated. Some things will never change.